Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the moment a quiet love finally steps into the light, when CEO Minh brings Sung Thuong to meet his grandmother, confesses that he has loved her for months, and hears the words that change everything. Don't let her go. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning light slipped through the thick green leaves and settled gently over the little vegetable garden, turning every drop of dew into something bright and fleeting. Sung Thuong stood among the rows of herbs and greens with a small basket in one hand, her movements unhurried, almost prayerful. The air still carried the freshness of night, cool soil, crushed leaves, and that clean mountain breeze that made even ordinary mornings feel new. She paused for a second and looked out across the yard, her face softening. There had been a time when mornings brought her nothing but heaviness. Wake up early, work hard, carry what needed carrying, endure what needed enduring. Back then, gratitude felt like something reserved for other people with stable homes, full tables, and futures they were not afraid to imagine. But now, standing in the garden she had nurtured with her own hands, she felt something close to peace. Not because life had become perfect, it hadn't, but because there was finally enough warmth in it for her to notice the good. She bent and picked a handful of cilantro, the roots still damp, the scent rising sharp and fresh the moment it touched her fingers. That smell always did something to her. It reminded her that happiness did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it lived in tiny things, a bunch of herbs, a morning breeze, a meal made from what the earth was willing to give. "Good morning, everyone," she murmured softly, as if speaking not only to the people who followed her story, but to the day itself. Her voice carried gratitude naturally. She thought of the kind comments she had read, the blessings strangers had sent her, the way people had chosen to care about her simple life in the hills. Each encouraging word had landed in her heart like morning dew on dry roots. She had lived so long in hardship that every small kindness still felt surprising. And then, of course, there was CEO Minh. His name alone brought a smile she could never quite control. She looked toward the corner of the garden where onions grew in neat rows and thought of him crouching there days earlier, trying to understand the soil, asking questions with real interest instead of polite distance. A powerful man from the city, yet somehow willing to stand in the dirt and learn the shape of her life, one ordinary detail at a time. That memory warmed her more than the sun. Today would be simple. That thought pleased her. She would cook instant noodles with fresh cilantro for herself later. She would climb the hill and harvest cabbage. She would sell what she could at the market. The money would be small, but honest. And after that, she would return home with the feeling she loved most. Not comfort exactly, but the satisfaction of knowing she had lived the day fully. She straightened, lifted the basket, and stepped onto the narrow red dirt path. Each step seemed to carry the same quiet message. Keep going, keep growing, keep being grateful. By the time the sun rose high enough to turn the market road white with heat, Sung Thuong was already seated beside her vegetables under a patch of weak shade. Midday in the market was always a test of endurance. The air turned heavy, dust stuck to skin, the sounds of bargaining, motors, footsteps, and voices all blurred into one long, restless wave. But she was used to it. In front of her lay neat piles of the morning's harvest, bright cilantro, sweet cabbage, a few extra greens she had tucked into the basket at the last minute. They were clean, fresh, and still cool from the hillside. She arranged them carefully, not to impress anyone, but because she respected what the earth had given her. A customer stopped and crouched slightly to inspect the bunches. "Big bunch or small?" Sung Thuong asked gently. The woman smiled at her. "Big, yours always looks fresh." Those words, simple as they were, filled her with quiet satisfaction. Trust, that was what mattered most in a place like this. Not loud praise, not spectacle, just the fact that people came back because they believed in the quality of what she brought. The sales were steady, not fast, not slow, enough. By the time the sun had shifted and the harshest heat began to soften, most of the vegetables were gone. A little money sat folded in the cloth purse tucked at her side. She counted it once, quickly, then put it away. There was enough to matter. That was good enough. She kept only a little for herself. A few greens for dinner, a little cilantro for noodles. That was all she needed. As the market gradually thinned, she packed up her things and stood. Her shoulders ached lightly, but it was the clean ache of a day well used. She stepped back onto the road with the last bunch of vegetables in hand and began the walk home. It was then, in that quiet stretch between market and evening, that anticipation entered her again. Would she see someone familiar today? The thought came and went so quickly she almost pretended not to notice it, but her heart noticed. It always did. At nearly the same time, far from the market but not far enough for his thoughts to escape her, CEO Minh stood at a construction site in Hamlet 5, staring at a bulldozer that refused to cooperate. Dust swirled around his shoes. Engines roared and cut off and roared again. Workers moved back and forth under the hot light, their voices clipped, practical, tired. Minh stood in the middle of it all, with his phone pressed to his ear, his tone controlled but carrying unmistakable urgency. "The machine is down?" he asked. On the other end, Thuong answered quickly. Repairs were underway. Someone had been called. It would be fixed by afternoon. Minh listened, jaw tight, then ended the call with a quiet exhale. Tomorrow was handover. There was no room for delay, and certainly no room for machinery failing at the wrong time. But the issue was at least moving toward a solution, and there was nothing more to do in that exact moment but trust the right people to do their jobs. His thoughts did what they had begun doing too often lately. They left work. The image that rose in his mind was not the bulldozer, not the site map, not the pending deadlines. It was Sung Thuong's shirt, the worn one she kept washing and wearing because she never bought for herself unless something had already become unusable. He had noticed it days ago and said nothing, but the thought had stayed with him. He wanted to buy her 2 new shirts, simple ones, comfortable, suitable for market days, for field work, for being at home. The idea would have sounded insignificant to anyone else. To him, it felt strangely urgent, not because clothes would change her life, but because he wanted her to feel looked after in all the small ways she was too used to ignoring. He got into the car. Instead of driving straight back, he turned toward Xuan Van Market. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windshield in long, bright bands. The road shimmered faintly ahead, and with every kilometer, the pressure of the construction site loosened, not disappeared, just moved aside enough to make space for something more human, more personal. When he reached the village road near the market, the day had begun to soften into gold. And there she was. Sung Thuong was walking slowly, the last bunch of vegetables in her hand, sweat still shining lightly near her temples. She looked tired, but not defeated. Her face held that same calm determination he had started recognizing everywhere in her voice, in her work, in the way she moved through the world without asking it to be kinder than it was. He sounded the horn once. She looked up in surprise. The second she recognized the car, something in her whole expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for him to feel it in his chest. He pulled over and lowered the window. "Sung Thuong," he called, his voice warmer than he intended. She came closer, smiling shyly. "You're here?" "I am," he said. Then, after a pause that wasn't really necessary, "Get in, I'll take you home." She hesitated only long enough to place the vegetables carefully in the trunk. He got out to help before she could say she didn't need it. When she finally slipped into the passenger seat, the cool air of the car closed gently around them, shutting out the dust and heat of the road. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Minh asked the simplest question first. "Tired?" She smiled. "A little." "How did the vegetables sell?" "All of them," she said. "Only this much left for dinner." He glanced at the bunch in the back and nodded as if that answer mattered more than any report he'd heard all day. She told him then about the greens from the high hill, how the mountain air made them sweeter, how she would cook them if he wanted to stay later. Her words were simple, practical, but every sentence carried a quiet care inside it. Min listened more closely than he ever listened in meetings. Then, after speaking briefly about the broken bulldozer and the site, he asked the question he had really been moving towards since leaving town. "Grandma is free at home today," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Would you like to visit her for a while? She mentions you often." The words settled between them softly, but they changed everything. Sung Thuong turned toward him. "Grandma?" she asked. He nodded. She'd be happy. Her heart gave a strange, quick flutter. That old woman, who had once given her a place to stay in the most uncertain season of her life, had somehow become more than a memory, more than a helper. She had become a bridge between refuge and belonging, between loneliness and whatever this new thing was that kept forming around Min and herself. Sung Thuong lowered her eyes, then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly, and as the car rolled forward through the golden evening light, both of them felt it. The distance between them had become smaller again, not through grand words, but through one simple invitation that carried the warmth of home. Warm dusk settled over the roadside store as CEO Min parked and turned to Lee Sung Thuong with a gentle smile. He had just invited her to visit his grandmother, and though she had agreed, her heart had not stopped racing since. The thought of stepping into the home of someone so important to him made her both nervous and strangely warm. When he suggested they buy a small gift first, she nodded at once. Inside the little store, yellow light fell over narrow shelves stacked with milk, biscuits, and fruit. Sung Thuong looked around carefully, thinking not of what was expensive, but of what an elderly woman might truly enjoy. She picked out a few cartons of milk and some ripe fruit, then held the bag close to her chest. When Min reached for his wallet, she stopped him softly but firmly. "No, please, this one is from me." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He understood immediately. It was not about money. It was about gratitude, dignity, and the quiet need to offer something with her own hands. Back in the car, the evening deepened into a soft, gold-blue haze. As they drove, Sung Thuong spoke of the days she had once spent in Grandma's little shack when life had felt cold and uncertain. She said the old woman had never asked too many questions, never made her feel small, never treated her like someone to pity. Min listened in silence, his fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. Every word made him feel more certain that bringing her here today was right. When the house finally appeared beneath warm yellow light, both of them grew quiet. The front door opened before they reached it. Grandma stood there smiling, her face soft with welcome. Min greeted her first. Then Sung Thuong stepped forward and offered the bag with both hands. "I brought a little milk and fruit for you, Grandma." The old woman accepted it with obvious joy and drew them inside. The house smelled of cooked rice and home, and the simple warmth of it made Sung Thuong's nervousness ease just a little. She carried the fruit into the kitchen to wash it, while Min sat with Grandma in the living room. For a few moments, only the sound of running water filled the air. Then Grandma asked the question directly, without hesitation. "You and Sung Thuong, is there something between you?" Min inhaled slowly. He had imagined this moment before, but now that it had come, he felt the weight of it in his chest. Still, he did not hide. "Yes," he said, "I have loved her for several months, and she feels the same." Grandma looked at him in silence for one heartbeat, then a bright smile spread across her face. "I knew it," she said. Min actually laughed. "You knew? I'm old, not blind," she replied. Then she took his hand warmly. "Sung Thuong is a good girl. Don't let her go. Hurry and plan the wedding so I can hold my great-grandchild while I still have strength." At that exact moment, Sung Thuong returned with the tray of fruit. She stopped the moment she saw their expressions. The room had changed. She could feel it instantly. Grandma looked at her and laughed with delighted affection. "Come sit down, my future granddaughter-in-law." Sung Thuong froze, cheeks burning, eyes wide with shock. Minh stood quickly and took the tray from her hands before she dropped it. She sat down slowly, heart pounding, while Grandma beamed at them both as if the future were already settled. They ate fruit together and talked as the evening deepened. Minh spoke of bringing Sung Thuong over more often, cooking meals for Grandma, even taking her fishing by the lake one day. Then, Grandma mentioned Thao. Minh answered calmly and clearly that Thao was only a friend and would remain only that. He did not want anyone to misunderstand his heart. When the hour grew late, Minh rose and said he would take Sung Thuong home. Grandma held Sung Thuong's hands before they left and whispered a blessing full of hope. Outside, night had fully fallen. The drive back was quiet, but no longer uncertain. They had been seen, accepted, and gently blessed. And in the silence between them, both understood that something important had changed. This was no longer only affection growing quietly in hidden corners. It had stepped into the light. As evening falls, CEO Minh stops with Lee Sung Thuong at a small roadside store so they can buy a thoughtful gift before visiting his grandmother. Sung Thuong insists on paying for the milk and fruit herself, wanting the gesture to come from her own heart. During the drive, she quietly shares how Grandma once gave her shelter and dignity during one of the hardest seasons of her life, and Minh listens with growing tenderness. When they arrive, Grandma welcomes them warmly, and while Sung Thuong washes the fruit in the kitchen, Grandma asks Minh directly if there is something between them. This time, he does not hide. He openly confesses that he has loved Sung Thuong for months and that she feels the same. Grandma immediately accepts and blesses their relationship, calling Sung Thuong her future granddaughter-in-law. By the time Minh drives her home that night, both of them know their love is no longer hidden. It has finally been seen, accepted, and blessed.